How's it going, ladies and gentlemen? My name is Christian, and welcome to, I don't know what we'll call this, maybe a talkie time with Christian. I wanted to get out of the den in the back my room where I normally do these kinds of things and sit in front of my nice little microphone and talk to my computer screen. But instead, this time, we've got a little lapel mic down here, and I'm talking to my phone. So it's a completely different thing. We also have the futon, the not so comfortable, very cheap futon that helps to fill the living room out. Every once in a while, you might hear some crinkling. My dog has a set of plastic bags from when I went to the grocery store yesterday, and he really likes laying on them, so I leave them out for him to lay on until we need to clean up, obviously. So what is this video about? Why are we out here in the living room and not in the old cave going over some more philosophy stuff? Rest assured, we are definitely still talking about philosophy today. No doubt about that. It wouldn't be an episode of Liberty After Dark without some of it. But I had an interesting thing come across my Twitter feed the other day. So interesting, in fact, that I decided to talk about it. It's called The Nature of Law by Roderick T. And it is one of, if not the most often cited cases for natural law, natural rights, this kind of greater moral cause or existence of greater morality that I've seen on Twitter lately. And I wanted to talk about it because I read through it. I thought it was very interesting, and I really enjoyed the process of going through it. But as you can see, I mean, there's a lot here. There's a good few pages of this. Admittedly, I blew the words up so it would be easier for me to read this while I'm in front of the camera talking to you guys. And I do have some sections highlighted and stuff like that. We won't be going over every square inch of this. I will leave a link to it in the description of this video so that you can check it out on your own time. But there are a couple of things that I have as like goals of this video. Obviously, I think it's, since I've got this whole thing in front of you and we're going to be talking about it, I think it's pretty clear that I have some disagreements with what's written by Long here. And I don't want the video to focus so much on those disagreements as much as I want it to kind of be like a template on how to go about finding the disagreements, really analyzing someone else's work, and what goes into the process of philosophical critique, we will say. Because I don't think anything in here is particularly damning, we'll say. There's plenty of things, again, that I don't agree with. There's plenty of things that I think could use some work. But again, this also isn't a traditional like peer-reviewed essay sort of thing. This was put out in a publication in the late 90s and, well, mid to late 90s. I think the first one was in 1994. And, but it's, again, it's something I see very often. So I'm going to be taking this probably a lot more seriously than the author had intended. And one section in particular, I'm going to be taking much more seriously than the author wants me to, because other people take it that seriously. But just a real quick summary, just so that you guys know, it's about 1/3, 1/4 preface, like kind of building up to the arguments, and then the rest of it is a combination of quotes and then the addressing counter arguments, which is where we're going to spend a lot of our time. So I'm going to put this away unless I need it later, and we're going to go ahead and switch to my notes, which would help to save you some time. Again, if you don't like anything that I say, or you think that I might be mischaracterizing Long on his positions, which again is not my goal at all through any of this, my intentions are to be as good faith as possible with the points that Mr. Long has presented. But I am going to be skipping some things that I don't feel are pertinent to the conversation we're going to have. Some of like the addressing counter-argument stuff I just didn't care about because they're not positions that I hold. And they don't really glean anything interesting into something that could sway my own position. So if you want to follow along, by the way, you can click on the link and we can kind of go through this together. Again, I'm going to be using my notes, so we're going to be skipping through some things. But it should be all right at the end of the day. Starting with part one, this is just the introduction. There's a couple of things in here that I think are important to know, just like get your head kind of around where Long is in this. This is most of this preface stuff, everything before part 4, I think is all just really interesting for getting a good understanding of where Long is in this. The first one is that law is that institution or set of institutions in a given society that adjudicates conflicting claims and secures compliance in a formal, systematic, and orderly way. So this is Long's definition of law. I don't think I have like any objections in this context or anything like that. But it is important because he's going to be using the term a lot. So I do appreciate him defining this so that we can all be on the same page. I'm not going to get into like some semantic argument about like, is this the proper definition of law? We will save that for later. He goes on to say that there's essentially two different types of laws, and there's a further subset than that. But there's a voluntary and coercive law, distinguished by the means whereby compliance is secured. Things like social pressures, boycotts, and the like, as he says, are examples of voluntary law, where a coercive law would be, mono or polycentric coercive law, two different types of that. Usually, monocentric is the most common. It's a single entity, like a government, bringing in the police to enforce their laws. They have a monopolized control over the ability to adjudicate and to create and etc. So that's the big thing there. Coercive, obviously, entailing that there's some kind of coercion, usually physical violence of some kind, in order to get people to comply with those laws, in contrary to the voluntary. He defines anarchist, and I'm not 100% sure. This is, I think, my first real semantic issue. Is anarchist is equal to rejecting of government, right? And advocates for voluntary law. I thought that was an interesting inclusion there, because I don't know if a lot of people would agree that advocating for voluntary law is like a necessary part of being an anarchist. This may seem kind of trite, but I think there is something in putting that extra step of advocates for voluntary law that makes the idea of the position of no rulers unique. A lot of people will say anarchism means no rulers, not no rules, and I think that's true, but I don't think it's true because anarchism means not no rules. I think it's true because no rulers doesn't imply not no rules. Again, this is kind of, semantic jargon, maybe not that important for this overall discussion, but something that kind of tipped off in my brain. And I kind of talked about this. I wrote some notes down. I didn't want to do this as like a whole script because I felt like that would be a little robotic. I'm not the best script reader. So I wanted to kind of just write some notes, write some things that I thought were important, and kind of go with the flow from that. And I asked the question, in my notes, what does anarchism have to do with voluntary law, without co-opting that into the definition? Like, where does it say anarchism is like the support of social pressures, boycotts, and the like? Because I'm sure we could come up with other examples, but that's his words. And to me, it stuck out. It stuck out a lot, because I think using language, particularly when I believe this person to have a good understanding of this distinction between the no rulers not entailing no rules, but not necessarily excluding or including that particular statement, is interesting to me. We're going to go ahead and go into part 2. Part 1 is very short, it's just the introduction. The 3 functions of law is what this is titled. In order for law to achieve its aim, it requires adjudication, legislation, and execution, or executive. It's going to be the branch associated with that. Execution, sounds like you're killing somebody, but it doesn't necessarily have to entail that. Judicial handles the disputes, legislative determines the rules, and executive ensures disputing parties submit to the adjudication and comply to rulings. They are the teeth of the law, per se. And I think it's not too hard to see how this model of what it takes, what are the 3 functions of law, or what is required to constitute a law in any kind of impactful sense, we'll put it that way, under that kind of context, under Long's context here. I think it's fair to say that these are like three criteria that you just have to have. If you're missing any one of these components, you're missing some compulsory aspect or some kind of adaptability or utility or any of these other things that you may want out of like a legal law system, or technically speaking, based off of the definition of law we've been given any kind of law system, a voluntary law system, a coercive law system. These are all just things that have to be for that definition to be filled. So if you have a semantic issue with the definition, you might have an issue with these, but I'm just going to take his word for it and move on. The next subsection is titled "Should Law Be Monopolized?" And there's basically three functional aspects of this, like coming into practice. And we have like absolutism, which is like three functions in single hands. So like a monarchy being judge, jury, and executioner sort of thing. You could think of it like that, or just any sort of single centralized power, and I mean wholly centralized, because the next one is constitutionalism, which is a single power that adjudicates these three subsections of law, or these three functions of law, to different entities. So we have, in the United States, for example, they have set up their system in a manner that is, we have the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch. And obviously there's some copy pasting happening as far as like making these terms sensible, but they're named these things for a reason. We could probably come up with examples of things that are named other things, like the House of Lords and Commons in the UK or some whatever, but the US is a pretty easy copy to see where these things come from. And one of the key distinctions that he makes here is that in anarchism, it doesn't necessarily mean that these three functions don't exist. What it means is that they are not monopolized by anyone. It's like a necessary requirement for anarchism. And this is something that I would agree with, right? When we talk about like law in a more conventional sense, like in a legal sense, in a stealing is bad and that carries X penalty kind of sense, we would think about like a dispute resolution organization being like a part of a company and being decentralized entirely. Like you could have, your Chase brand DRO or Walmart or Bob's DRO down the road, and these things may be operating off of like a communal body of law or something like that they've all developed, mostly out of the sake of efficiency, I could imagine. But there is no one group that by just authority or right holds total control without the consent of the other parties involved. There's no one who can just come in and overrule Bob's DRO rulings if everybody consented to the process of Bob's DRO. Stuff like that. That's, I think, a good example of what anarchism, that means. It says the three functions are not monopolized. I do have a slight issue with the correlation between anarchism relying on executive. When we think of executive, we think of, I think there's a lot of other things that could have been said before to make this like super clear, so I won't spend too much time on this. But when we think executive, we think like essentially like policing. This is all a direct result of like executive actions towards ensuring compliance towards a given set of laws. And I can't help but wonder how relevant an executive action would necessarily be, because if you've already consented to submit to whatever the terms of an agreement are or whatever, and you do so, and let's say this contract is written with a clause that says if you don't do so, this is X penalty that you consent to, so that there's no like breach of contract maneuvering or something like that. I don't know if executive would exist exactly as this function is outlined, but I think it's close enough. I'm nitpicking a little bit in this section if you can't tell. But I think some of these things might be important just to, again, show that like I want to present his ideas as they're written, and I just kind of want to give some of my thoughts in this early section before we get into the real meat and potatoes of this. He goes into another section talking about monocentric law in relating to Locke. because a lot of people are very persuaded by John Locke's arguments in the matter. I don't really want to talk too much about this, but I think it's interesting just to say that Locke makes a very common case that like everybody in the state of nature, we're all like sovereign entities that have the ability to enact all three functions of law. In this case, is like the legislator and whatnot, all in the state of nature, but we can voluntarily give those things up to a government, and there's all sorts of reasons why we would want to do that, in Locke's opinion. And he basically makes a case, Locke v. Locke sort of case, why Locke's own arguments are kind of self-defeating. And I think it's pretty compelling, but not super relevant to our discussion. Just didn't want to skip over it without mentioning it. Lest, if you want to read more about it, by all means. Part 3, law versus legislation. I wrote a lot in my notes on this section because there was a lot in this section compared to the others, but I don't know how much I really want to spend on all of this. I think some of it is important, but not particularly all of it. Law versus legislation. It starts with kind of like a summary of Plato's Minos, where Socrates is engaged in a conversation with an individual about like what is law, what makes good law, these kind of questions about law. And basically Socrates comes to the point that like law is the correct judgment of the state. It relates to the topic of like power and authority in a pretty meaningful way, in a sense that ancient legal practices tended to, and this is all Long's words, by the way, so any of this could be incorrect, but ancient legal practices tended to lean towards law being declared or discovered rather than created. So it was something outside of the body that was adjudicating the laws, per se, that these laws were like derived from, whether that be a higher power or from truth of reason or whatever. They weren't like the perspective is that they weren't like fabricating laws to suit their personal desires as much as they were discovering them again. Like they uncovered some kind of buried treasure about like, oh, this is how society must be, so we will make a law to support that. I think it's an interesting idea. He goes on to talk a bit about like law positivism, which is the idea that like we kind of create law to shape the world around us and to create like a reality that we want to live in. And I think there's a big push between these two ideas in this paper, in a sense, essentially the sense that like law positivism is like a modern concept with some tiebacks to earlier civilizations like Greece, for example, and Athens. But he keeps coming back to this idea that Socrates argues that only decrees based on knowledge of objective justice and injustice can count as true laws, and all states attempt to legislate the just, but are mistaken on what the just is. We're going to get more into this later, but basically what we're talking about now is we're talking about a objective conception of justice, or an objective justice that a conception of justice can be built from. This metaphysical problem is one that is, it's one that stemmed for a long time. Let me put it that way. What is justice? Is justice real? Is justice something that we like kind of think about in like an idealized way? And there's so many different answers to that question that I don't know if we're quite there yet. But Long is positing this in a way that really makes it come off like he believes that there is like a true justice. And we'll get there. He does. And to me, that's something that he's already brought up that's going to need a fair bit of substantiation in order for me to be happy with that. So this is taken almost directly from his work. Plato's Minos appears to imply all states attempt to legislate particular conceptions of justice. Insofar as they legislate the concept, they legislate the same thing. and these legislations are genuine laws. Insofar as they legislate different conceptions, any number of decrees could not be genuine laws. That last bit is paraphrased. But basically, if you're operating off of like an incomplete or wrong conception of justice, obviously deriving laws from that could lead to an innumerable number of errors if your goal is to have a law that is just if you were to have a law that is just a man interpretation of justice, which we'll get a little bit later. I'll actually just go ahead and summarize this next part while we're on that. There's two senses of law. Aquinas talks about this a little bit. There's natural law, which is like the principles of justice requisite to genuine human well-being and inherent law and inherent in human nature as created by God. That's Aquinas' opinion. But also human law, where human law means applying an increase in specificity to allow the natural law to become more usable or to increase utility, i.e. reducing the provisions of natural law without contradicting natural law. He doesn't go into a great deal of what this exactly would look like. I mean, he gives a few examples, but more specifically, the contradiction of natural law. I'm curious how far you could push these things in order to like increase utility, kind of taking like an ameliorative perspective on analysis towards some of these human laws, how far you could push them before a contradiction is necessarily raised. And this will relate to another question I have later. He touches on natural law and customary law for a little bit. Customary law is essentially just the idea that certain legal systems were developed by researching what people were kind of already doing and didn't like, and then just putting it in a book and saying like, this is the law now, when they socially kind of upheld these things before. There's apparently some debate that, you know, whether customary law kind of like supersedes natural law or if they're talking about the same thing or whatever. But, you know, it all kind of relates back to that idea that the customary law must at some point be built out of the natural law, because the natural law is what caused those people to act in those certain behaviors to begin with, is the easiest way of putting that. In section 3, there's a lot of quotes on law versus legislation, like a lot of them. Like I could probably, yeah, so like from here all the way over to here is like all quotes. So if you wanted to read some more on that, there's plenty of smart names in there. A lot of them I didn't know at all, and I just didn't feel like including them was productive because this video is already somewhere in the ballpark of 20 minutes. And we haven't even gotten to the meat yet. Oh boy. All right. Part 4, the basis of natural law. This is it. This is where all of my notes are. This is the meat and potatoes. This is where we're gonna find the goods. First subsection: is there room for natural law? The question starts with, is natural law worth considering? Natural law is called natural to distinguish itself from conventional law, man-made law, and supernatural law, divine or spiritual law. What is the metaphysical basis for natural law, and what is the epistemological basis of natural law? These are two questions that we're going to be asking. He's presupposing that we're asking these, which is good, because I'm going to ask them. And he's going to do his best to answer them. In the first subsection, I suppose, is who has the burden of proof? And I'm just going to get into this one. I have a lot of notes in this section, but I'm going to try to get through it, and then we can talk about some of it in the end. A lot of this is taken verbatim. I don't have like exact paragraph numbers or anything, but if you want to follow along in this section, it'd probably be one of the easiest, because I'm going to be using a lot of quotes directly from it, or slight paraphrases. To believe natural law is to simply believe that there are moral standards that transcend the practices of any given community, rational grounds for condemning the actions of Nazis. We don't ordinarily take ourselves to be expressing a purely personal subjective preference, and seem to implicitly assume that there are objective moral standards. So let's just take a brief second to unpack that a little bit. He's making the case here for an objective morality. That's what's happening, 100%. The quote in particular, we don't ordinarily take ourselves to be expressing purely personal subjective preferences, blah, 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 is like the moral subjectivist position. It's that moral truths are opinions that we hold that can be formed by any number of whims, desires, whatever. And as such, we can't act on them as if they are some kind of objective is in reality. Just because I don't like people to, I don't know, let's pick something moral. We'll do something easy. We'll softball it just for the sake of this. We'll say like gay marriage. Just because I am okay with gay marriage and Bob across the street is not, doesn't mean that either of us necessarily get to like impose that onto the other. We just kind of have to accept the fact that we have differing opinions on the matter and, you know, kind of go our separate ways. That's the position that like a moral subjectivist would take, as opposed to what Longhair is doing, which is saying that, and presupposing to a certain extent that there are objective moral standards because it's sensible, because we kind of seem to appeal to them. We'll leave that for now because we will be coming back to this topic. It's going to shift a little bit. This kind of is in the conversation of the burden of proof topic. The fact it seems to me that I am sitting in front of my computer doesn't guarantee that I am doing so. But if this doubt is entertained, then we would never be justified in believing anything. This is a case against skepticism in, not skepticism in like a YouTube sense, but in like a philosophical sense. So skepticism about reality. Am I real? Are you real? Is this table real? Is this paper real? Is reality real? Is the skepticism that he's talking about? How can we know anything for certain? There's too many factors that get in the way of us doing that. And I think this appeal is not very compelling. So we'll give him just a little bit of extra time to think about how he wants to address this. So because of this, because we would never be justified in believing anything, we are justified in accepting the way things initially seem as true pictures of the world, despite the possibility that they may be mistaken. And the burden of proof is on those who oppose these ordinary beliefs. Now, I have a lot of issues with that statement. I am not a skeptic. I am not a person who believes that reality is like a fabrication of the mind. However, I do respect the process of philosophy enough to acknowledge that if I want to claim to have like defeated an argument or a counterposition, that I need to give like an actual argument that would address their claims and concerns. And a skeptic would read this and say like, what does literally any of this have to do with what I just said? The biggest problem of this for me specifically is the burden of proof is on those who oppose these ordinary beliefs. Because what constitutes an ordinary belief and for who? This was an immediate first time reading through it, and I've read through this 2 or 3 times now. 3 times now, actually, because the notes were written on the 3rd time after 2 read-throughs. Every time, just this massive red flag, just boing, like we have an issue here. Because there's no demonstration of a non-arbitrary metric for an ordinary belief. An ordinary belief for me, an ordinary belief for you, an ordinary belief for someone in like Pakistan or China or Korea or Indonesia or anywhere else, we are going to hold a totally different set of ordinary beliefs that are ordinary to us. And without a non-arbitrary metric by which to judge these, I have no idea how we're going to use like ordinary beliefs to determine what constitutes like an objective natural law sort of morality. Big issue. We'll see if he addresses it. Spoiler alert, I wouldn't get your hopes up too much. But if our ordinary practice of moral judgment commits us to believing in natural law, then natural law is a part of our worldview, and we're justified in accepting it until someone gives us a good reason to reject it. I came up with an example of this off the top of my head, and I think it's actually a pretty good one. If someone holds that unicorns are true, like true things that exist in reality and they're out there, and all you got to do is see them, and they're in the forests or whatever. What reason other than there is no evidence to support the existence of unicorns need one give? This burden of proof shifting is really lame, honestly. It's like one of my least favorite games in philosophy. This and like the semantic language game, I think can be important in certain cases, but like when it's a never-ending, like, no, it's your burden of proof, no, it's my burden of proof. Like at some point, somebody's got to bite a bullet here, okay? And this would be the perfect place to bite that bullet. Back to the unicorn example. If I genuinely believe that unicorns are real, how would you possibly address that without using some variation of there is no evidence to support the existence of unicorns? You can say, look, we've found all of these horses, we've seen all these things, I'm a geneticist, I don't know what the combination, I'm making things up now, but just to get to the point, they're all going to come back to the same thing, that we don't have enough evidence or any evidence to suggest that unicorns were real, apart from you saying so and maybe some fables and stories and whatnot. And if that isn't sufficient to break someone's conception that unicorns are real, then the burden of proof game that you're playing is broken and bunk and doesn't matter. Or two, it's not actually up to the person who's saying, like, what do you mean there's no evidence for unicorns, to demonstrate that there are no unicorns? I don't think this is very hard to grasp. I think it's a little disappointing, honestly. I don't know Long, not making a judgment of his character, just a judgment of this work. I feel like it's a judgment. I feel like it's disappointing for the amount of setup into this work to immediately go into what I feel like is just an attempt to weasel out of the issue. Some of you may disagree with that. Which is one of the reasons why I was so impassioned by that particularly kind of moot line, in my opinion. Much more spicy stuff to go. Another section, natural law serves no useful purpose. Long's addressal of this, I think, is fair, honestly. His conception of natural law is it is a guide, not a protection. It's not like the Constitution that will come fly out of the case and defend you. Natural rights aren't going to fall from the sky and protect you from being genocided or something. He uses the Nazi example quite a bit in here. One thing I think is pretty interesting is there's a couple differences between rights that are delineated here. We have normative, legal, and de facto rights. Normative is the claims that ought to be respected and protected, versus legal, the claims that a given legal institution officially announces it will respect and protect, and de facto rights, the claims that actually receive protection and respect in a given society. Natural law is not a special kind of legal right, but a template for legal rights to emulate, a normative right. Take the example of a Holocaust rescuer. Despite the law condemning Jewish folk, the rescuer was motivated to help them regardless. The rescuers were motivated by an understanding of a higher order law which grants the victims normative rights the legal laws may not. A lot of that is paraphrased into my own notes. That was a big multi-paragraph section that I just boiled down there. Part of the point of him bringing this up is to kind of demonstrate the fact that, in his view, natural law may not be a shield that comes down from the sky and protects you from, being holocausted or being a victim of Nazi atrocities or something like that. But it is something that is like a constant motivating force on human action. That is the whole point of bringing up the Holocaust rescuers who helped people escape from these camps or from the ghettos or any of these other situations that they were in. And my biggest issue with this is, how could you ever demonstrate that this compulsion via higher natural law is not actually just their preference towards those rights and like a moral, like a subjective moral perspective? Like, They believe, because they believe it, for whatever reason they believe it, doesn't matter, that people ought not be holocausted. Okay? That's their subjective moral interpretation, right? Why is that implausible compared to there exists an objective moral standard that they acted in compliance with? I don't think that this paper does a very good job of addressing that consideration. But he does talk about it a little bit, slightly. In order to demonstrate that they did not recognize some higher power of rights means that you must presuppose that natural rights don't exist. What if, let's play a game, what if natural rights did exist? And somebody who had no knowledge of them at all, they were just, whatever, they're a human who was born without any conception of natural rights at all. We, taught them to read, write, etc., whatever. Make the hypothetical work for you to make it happy. Go on this journey with me. And they came to the same conclusion in the same scenario, but they had no knowledge of natural rights. We haven't gotten there yet, but just to get ahead of this a little bit, he's already going to say that natural rights aren't like some spiritual phenomenon that is like transcendental of reality or something like that. It isn't like a spooky ghost or something. So the only way that this person could have knowledge of natural law has been purged from them. All physical possibilities, nobody's talked about it. If there's like some gene for natural law, we erase it, whatever. And they come to the same conclusion, is that by mere happenstance, they just so happened to pick the same thing as natural law, so it still proves natural law? Or does it demonstrate that people could be motivated by forces other than natural law? Maybe you'll find that compelling to see how your conception of what natural law is, someone might subjectively agree with that conception and just act on it, and you'll be like, oh, that person's acting in accordance with natural law. Versus you both just having subjective conceptions of what is good and both acting on them in similar ways. It's not impossible. That's all I'm saying. It's not impossible. I don't like this this line where it's presented like, oh, you can't possibly prove, or you can't possibly say, or even suggest that they weren't acting in accordance with natural law unless you presuppose the natural law doesn't exist. This is the burden of proof game all over again. I don't like it. We're going to move on. The next section. Let me make sure I didn't skip anything, actually. Yeah, I almost read through the whole thing again, so that would have made this a lot longer. There couldn't be such a thing as natural law. This is one of the next big sections. Subsection. Natural law. A tool of manipulation? Is there something spooky or mysterious about natural law? This is the question. Natural law is about descriptive facts, not normative facts. This is really huge. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this section. He breaks this up into a couple different ways. So we're going to kind of go through my notes. And you know what? Actually, I kind of want to read this from the horse's mouth. So if you give me a second. All right. We've busted out the scroll. We're going through this. I wanted to read this section from him because I think my notes skipped some things that might help you. I am still not going to read this verbatim. It would take way too long. But we've set up a scenario where a pamphlet from a man named Wilson, written in 1987, called Natural Law, or Don't Put a Rubber on Your Willy, which sounds hilarious, by the way. It makes me kind of want to read it. He characterizes natural rights theory as a view that some sort of metaphysical entity called a right resides in a human being like a ghost residing in a haunted house. The implication is that natural rights are too weird to be believable. Wilson wants to treat natural rights as if they are supposed to be descriptive facts, but natural rights are normative facts. To say that Wilson has a natural right to be treated in manner X is not to say that there's some kind of invisible sprite lurking somewhere inside Wilson's body. Rather, what it means is this. It is A, morally obligatory for other people to treat Wilson in manner X, or B, it is morally permissible for Wilson or his agent to force other people to treat Wilson in manner X. In other words, natural rights consist in facts about what people ought to do, how people ought to treat each other. So he goes on, back into my notes. Some people talk as though A and B are true because Wilson has a right to be treated in manner X. But it is only that A and B are descriptive facts, not some higher order motivation. So basically what he's saying here is there's not like a root, like Wilson ought to be treated this way, so therefore A and B. It's A and B, therefore. The A and B are what is important here. There's nothing higher than that that motivates A and B. So if you're going to accept this, natural rights can only be dismissed if the entire notion of objective morality is dismissed. And to that, I say, yes. I believe if you construct this scenario in this sort of way, which is pretty clever and pretty good, honestly, it all requires that you presuppose objective morality exists. And when we're talking about natural law, if you're going to presuppose objective morality, your argument is natural law, therefore natural law. It's not, you can call natural law whatever you want, put whatever spin you want on it. Objective morality and natural law are the same idea in a different set of character clothing. So that whole section of what I think was actually some pretty interesting stuff, talking about the difference between normative and descriptive facts and how these two ideas like relate to one another, gets boiled down into, well, this is all true because I presuppose objective morality is true. It's like, great. Here's the real meat. This is the part, the moment that we've all been waiting for. The metaphysical basis of natural law. Now, these 9 steps are, by the author's own admission, not an argument. I don't believe that. What he means to say is that they're not a completed argument. But I have seen these so often presented as one of the best arguments for natural law that I'm going to treat them like that. And this is to Long's detriment, unfortunately. He kind of presents these things in a way that I feel like is admittedly trying to protect himself a little bit, but because I think he knows that there are some kind of issues here. So again, I'm going to paraphrase these. Some of them I've taken much more verbatim than others because I feel like there's a lot of nuance to them. But these are the 9 points. Skeptics imply morality is subjective. This suggests impulses without cognitive intent. Desire is a response to an apparent value. First off, skeptics imply morality is subjective. Great. This suggests impulses without cognitive intent is, I don't think, anywhere in that statement. I think you can have cognitive intent on any number of subjective things that you do, any number of subjective preferences or whims or choices can have cognitive intent behind them. I don't see how your personal evaluation of, like, a great example of thinking about this is like, is it subjective whether or not you buy the house on Cherry Street or on Broad Street, right? Say you're looking at 2 houses. Is that a subjective choice? Well, you could say that there's any number of factors that could influence your decision. The price, the color of the house, the location, the school in the area, whatever, pick whatever things you want off the top of your head. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to your personal valuation of those things. He's going to get to this in a second, so I don't want to go too much further on that, but perhaps you can see where I'm kind of going there. Number 2, good and value are inherently relational concepts. To be good or valuable is to be good for or valuable to someone. Yes, I think that's true. 3, Thus, each of us implicitly seeks goods that are both objective and agent relative. Sure, why not? 4. A living organism cannot be fully explained without appeal to that organism's natural ends or goals. Natural ends provide the context to the objective, or content to the objective, excuse me. Why? Why do we have to, why can a living organism not be fully explained without an appeal to that organism's natural ends or goals? I think this idea of like fully explained, like in what sense? If we're just empirically describing what it is to be a human, why do I need to know the function of literally anything to empirically describe it? I could be like, there's an eye, it's got these things in it, it's got hair, it's bipedal, you know, we don't have to know the function necessarily. You can describe a hammer without knowing what it does. Maybe you could say that you wouldn't have like full knowledge of what that thing is, but I think you would be talking about the exact same thing if you could, you know, describe a hammer to somebody, them have no idea what a hammer is, but be able to picture and draw the same object. You have the same conception of a hammer. Its extension would still include the same ideas because it's the same conception. It's just that the individual in question hasn't discovered that yet. So I don't know how I feel about this. I feel like it's a bold claim, but perhaps I'm missing something on that one. Natural ends can be rank ordered according to centrality and importance, which in turn are functions of teleological explanatory power. We can compare attributes A and B and choose the ones that more aptly explain a given end. If any of you guys are getting Rand vibes, I don't think that's unjustified here. Let's go into 6. Just as the end for which a thing is used may not be its most explanatory end, so likewise even the end for which a thing is created may not be its most explanatory end. A knife can cut, but can also scare away aggressors, regardless of the intent of its usage. I think he gives a decent example there of what he's trying to say. The usage of a tool or a given thing does not necessarily explain what its true intent, we'll say, is. What like its maximal utility is in. He gives another example that I didn't carry over of like a pine cone sitting on a desk. It's like, okay, is the tent of a pine cone to be a paperweight or is it to become a pine tree, you know? I think it's, okay, fine, we'll take that. Here's a doozy, number 7. The primary natural end of a human is not to reproduce, but to live one's life as a human. Poetic, but hold on. And some lives can be more human than others, since reason is a human being's most explanatory feature. A life is more human to the extent that it expresses reason. Who? What? Why? Where? How? When? Like, what? That's a pause moment. This, I think, is something that was like really, really poetic in the Enlightenment era. It's like, oh, humans are the rational animal. Like, they're capable of all of these great things and conceptualizing and rationalizing and yada yada yada. Rational animal. You'll see this all of the time in like Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment philosophy. But to just go out there and say that a human being's most explanatory feature is their capacity for reason, that seems arbitrary to me. I think there are all sorts of distinguishing features about humans compared to other creatures that you could use to separate the two. Dexterity, for example. You could look at our ability to learn languages. That doesn't necessarily imply reason. Cognitive processes are distinct in regions of the brain. We just so happen to get the one that also does reason, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to. Great example. Dolphins have, we believe, some capacity of language, right? But we don't consider them rational creatures in the same way that humans, but maybe the dolphin uprising is not as far away as we thought. But basically what I'm trying to get at is that we could come up with any number of distinguishing features that separate humans from every other creature. Genetics is another great example. Like, you compare the genetic code from one species of creature or family of creatures or whatever, blow it out as far as you want, you're going to find like really clear differences that separate these creatures from each other. And so to say like, oh, it is reason, it sounds nice, but I don't think it's actually that compelling. I think animals are much more capable of rationalization than we give them credit for. Now, if they quote unquote, meet the standard that we would say of like a rational creature, perhaps. But to say it's like uniquely distinguishing for us to be able to rationalize, I don't know about that. And I'm not just trying to be difficult for this paper. I don't know if I like the conception of man as like the rational animal, and like its best form being the most rational. I think there is some truth in that, but I think it's like a truth by common end, not so much truth by principle here. I think we don't. I think we have a similar end in this regard, but we get there in completely different ways. To just outright state that, to me, is a big pill to swallow. One that's completely unsubstantiated, by the way. It's just said. It is the human's most defining explanatory feature is reason. Maybe you agree with that. Maybe you find it compelling, but I really didn't. A life that exemplifies reason only in the means one chooses to achieve one's ends is not as human as one that exemplifies reason in both means and ends. Basically, maximal reason makes peak human, is his argument. And then 9, if we subordinate others to our own purposes, treating them as prey or objects of manipulation, we are choosing a life that is inferior by our own standards, thus obligated to choose peaceful relations when available. There's a claim being made here towards universalizability that I think I empathize with a lot, but I don't know if it's like applicable here. I think it's trying to be shoehorned in at the last minute because we've already made a distinguishing characteristic between like values of humanness here, right? And what if my natural law conception is one that says like, well, the apex humans are the ones that get rights. These subhumans don't. This comes back to just like an ambiguity around like what this natural law entails and where it's grounded, where it comes from. I'll just go over this again. Long claims that this isn't an argument for natural law, but like an outline for one. It's like the first steps towards building an argument for a natural law. But this paper is so often, I see it on Twitter all the freaking time from a couple people who I think are really smart, that I had to talk about it. And this is like the biggest meat section of it. I do want to get through a couple of this last bit of sections. I'm not going to do a ton on this. I think we got like through a lot of the big stuff. But the epistemological basis, I think, is pretty interesting. Common objection. Natural law is not open to scientific tests because normative statements are not testable. Is this a mistake? Normative statements / judgments are open to testing. This is Long's opinion. Normative statements entail empirical statements. It sounds crazy, but he's actually not entirely wrong here, but he's missing something. Consider 2 normative statements. Adolf is a virtuous person, and a virtuous person would never participate in genocide. These 2 normative statements entail an empirical statement. Adolf did not participate in genocide, which can be falsified. This is apex levels of missing the point, unfortunately. The issue is not whether or not you can create an empirical statement given moral contexts. You can do that. If you accept that Adolf is a virtuous person and a virtuous person would never participate in genocide, if you accept those, you can create an empirical statement based on those normatives that says Adolf did not participate in genocide. It would necessarily have to be so, or one of those premises must be wrong. Just because we can falsify that statement doesn't mean that we know anything about the truth value of the normative statements that constructed it. We are being asked to say like, oh, look, if you just accept natural law as real, then you can create these empirical statements, and then you can run them up against each other and see what you come up with. But that's not the issue. It's completely missing the point of the section that he quoted in this section, which is how can we be sure that these normative statements have any bearing of truth at all? They are untestable. They are normative statements. He doesn't disagree with that. The statement, Adolf is a virtuous person, is untestable. We can't. Now, or you could say it the other way around. The statement, a virtuous person would never participate in genocide. We can't test that. We have to assume that it's correct because we have to have an understanding of what objective virtue is, which is essentially just saying you have to know exactly what natural law is in order to be able to make a determination. And what we're doing right now is trying to prove that natural law exists. So you have to use natural law to prove natural law. I don't like that. It doesn't follow in the way that I think he thinks it does. You can also test normative beliefs by verifying conflict with one another. I think this is getting to the same point. It's like if two normative ideas are clashing, how do we know which one to keep and which one to get rid of? Like, let's say we have in the same book, murder good, murder bad. What standard do you use to pick one of those if they're in the book of natural law or just in the book of law in general, without appealing to like one of them is inherently true because I get the feelies when I look at it, right? Like, it's very intuitive for us to say like, oh, well, obviously you would keep the murder bad one because the murder good one's wrong. None of us want to murder or be murdered. But philosophy is not that easy. We don't just get to hand wave it away. And I think that's really the big things that I wanted to touch on. There was another section that I think was kind of interesting. Knowledge versus mere justification. You know, the protests that moral beliefs can count as knowledge. And I like the conversation on what constitutes true knowledge. And I think there's a lot there to go into. But this video is already going to almost be an hour long. And I haven't even done my wrap up yet. So we'll say that if you want to go into that on your own time, I think I've spoiled well enough by this point for you to go and make your own determinations on that last couple of sections. And there is more to this document that you can read, and I would encourage it if you thought that this was an entertaining kind of go-through on this. But look, there's something that I brought up, or that I haven't even brought up yet, that is super damning to this whole article, and it's Hume's law. You guys have heard me talk about Hume's law a lot, but I think for here, like, even if everything he said from beginning to end about natural law was true, which I don't believe, but if it is all true, it is all correct, and it all follows, Hume's law walks in and says, okay, so what? So there are these true objective morals that exist in reality that we can follow, and they're out there. Whatever they look like or mean or are, they're out there. What compulsion is there to follow them? Where is the is that says you are going to follow these natural laws? Nowhere. There's no moral compulsion for you to follow the natural laws unless you subjectively decide to follow them. And then we're back in the same place. We're back all the way at the beginning when we started getting into the meat and potatoes of this, where your preference towards what moral system you act under is just up to you. It is just subjective. Even if natural law existed and was real, the only reason to follow it is because you want to follow it. And I think that, to me, is the big thing that I wanted addressed in this that wasn't addressed. Anything that tries to attempt to tie itself to objective reality and to morality has to bridge Hume's law. You cannot have an objective morality with any weight whatsoever unless you are to bridge Hume's law. bridging Hume's law is the biggest hurdle that this article did not cross. It didn't even attempt to jump it. It did a lot of things like presupposing that morality is objective without really substantiating that. It's like, oh, we get a little warm, fuzzy feeling when we think about, you know, petting puppies. That must be like morally good. Not a very good substantiation for an objective morality, in my opinion. Some other closing thoughts. I felt like I really had to like burn through this because there was so much content, and I really wanted to keep this under an hour, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And I hope you could kind of see that, one, I wanted to address a lot of my concerns with this article. That was a big motivating factor for me doing this video. But I also kind of hope that you guys can watch this video and kind of see like how the process of going through these things is, and how going through these is it's just as much about consuming the information in front of you as it is looking at it in a critical eye. Like a lot of things in the beginning, for example, like it just is like definition of law and like anarchism. I had qualms, but what did I always say? We're going to operate with his definitions, because I feel like if we're going to give his ideas the best, fairest shake possible, getting caught up in things like semantics or things that we can address later. If his arguments are going to have issues, it's going to be more than just the semantics, unless it's something crazy like law equals butterfly. I might have had an issue with that, but well, I hope you guys enjoyed that blazing speed rip through the article by Long here. If you guys have any other documents or essays or videos or whatever that you guys would like me to go through and either critique or just give my thoughts on, or you know, I may not always have a critique for some of these things. Some of them might just be really good and I can just talk about them on the channel. One of them I have an idea of to do later, but it's a little bit off of the typical moral track that we do, so I'll have to think about that one. But yeah, I think that's it. If you guys liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe. If you liked me sitting on the futon and kind of being here and more like we're chatting across each other in the living room and less sitting in the den, let me know. Maybe I should do more videos like this. But yeah, that's it. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day, and take it easy.